China and the United States say they're making progress on trade despite ongoing tensions. Can the world's two largest economies set aside their differences? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Chinese and U.S. officials spoke over the phone this week, reaffirming their commitment to follow through on the Phase 1 agreement reached back in January. But even as the two sides make headway on commerce, Beijing and Washington continue to trade barbs over a number of issues, including data security, the coronavirus pandemic, and Hong Kong's new security law. Joining us now to talk about all of this, there's a lot to discuss, by the way. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from Beijing, Einar Tangen. He's a political and economics affairs commentator, also in Beijing. Wang Cong, he's chief reporter for the English language edition of the Global Times. With us here in Washington, Ashton is senior director of government affairs for the U.S.-China Business Council. And also with us from Washington, Jeff Moon. He's an international trade and government affairs consultant. I want to welcome all of you to the show. Einar, why don't I begin with you? I mean, China and the United States had this conversation on the phone after this delay. Looks like things kind of ramping up in the right direction. Both sides sounded optimistic afterwards. The U.S. side saying they're making progress. Beijing saying it was a constructive dialogue. So what changed and where are we?
Well, I don't think anything's changed. Actually, China is continuing to follow through on what it said was going to be, what it agreed to. And this is a stark contrast to a lot of the kind of bickering on the side, the accusations from the Trump administration almost on a daily basis. I think there's a realization that this is, a lot of this is political in terms of what Trump is trying to do, deflection politics, etc. And that over the long term, China will look better if it is in fact following through with the agreements it made.
Wang Cong, what's at stake here for Beijing?
Well, here in Beijing, I think, as Mr. Trump said about the Phase 1 deal, a lot of people now also are a little bit questioning whether this China's goodwill and good gesture in the Phase 1 deal to increase purchase of U.S. products and others can still help to ease the bilateral tension. So you can see, even after this phone call, the reactions or the attention to this has been very, very limited because of the rising tensions on a wide range of issues, from military to Hong Kong to South China Sea, as you mentioned in the lead up. So I think as far as the Phase 1 deal, China is and will committed still to carry out this deal. But I think a lot of people are now have questions about whether this can help ease the tension.
Well, Anna, I want to get your take on that. With so much tension, as Wang Cong rightly pointed out, this seems to be maybe the only silver lining out there, any light in terms of communication between these two countries. So how important is it?
I would say it's critically important, Mike. This is a very politicized relationship right now and a very political moment in the United States. There certainly are very real challenges and disagreements in the relationship, but I would characterize it as the health of the relationship, a functional relationship, really is hanging by a thread right now, and that thread is the trade relationship, which means it is the Phase 1 deal. Thankfully, the negotiators on both sides continue to support the deal and continue to say that implementation is coming along. However, it really is overshadowed here in D.C. pretty frequently by all of the other issues and the constant new announcements from the administration that are aggressive in nature and kind of putting the relationship in a tailspin.
Jeff, the president's up for re-election. It's a tough fight. He appears to be behind, if you believe the polls, and of course only one poll matters. That's the one in November. But right now, COVID deaths hovering around 180,000. He's got racial unrest, an issue that he really hasn't been he's been struggling with now for months since the death of George Floyd. And we know domestic victories this late in your administration, they're not going to come easily. Foreign policy wins, though, are easier to get. So how important would a trade deal be for the Trump administration?
Well, in terms of this specific deal and the call that we just had, I think it was mostly important for symbolic reasons. As you all suggested, this is the one area where we can actually agree on things. And the deal specifically said that we would check in once in a while. The time period came up and there were questions. Well, why aren't we checking in? So they checked in, and symbolically they're saying we're on track. As for the substance, however, the announcements after these kinds of meetings are never very specific, and this wasn't either. You could have taken the statements on both sides, and really the parties could have just read the table of contents together, or they could have substantively really dug into all the issues. I suspect that what really happened was somewhere in the middle, and that they reviewed the non-purchase areas where China is performing and the progress that they're making, and probably talked about the inability, in all likelihood, to complete all of the purchases that were specified in the deal and how they're going to manage that. So that's been checked off, and in the meantime, all of these other controversies are swirling around, but we do have at least one area where we have some ongoing stability.
You mentioned symbolism. We know that this president likes style, substance perhaps not as much. As he looks at the landscape out there, you're looking at Nebraska, which he took by 25% in 2016. The latest poll there, it's narrowed to about 2% between him and Biden. Iowa also very, very close. North Carolina, a big pork producing state, Biden ahead slightly. These are kind of his base areas. Is the messaging important for him to say, hey, we're trying to get something done to help these Midwestern areas that have been hit hard by this trade war?
Absolutely. The agricultural states are core base states for Trump. China knows that. China struck back in those specific areas. And as it turns out, through all the other circumstances that have happened, those are probably the biggest losers out of this trade war. I think Trump's prospects are not very good going forward. So that's why you see him trying to divert attention. The Republican convention is going on, and China is coming up as a theme. Nothing new is being said, and the claims so far are very vague that are out there. But Trump is using China as a way to divert attention, even though there are very serious substantive differences that are being addressed in the midst of all that rhetoric.
And Einar, the White House released its second-term agenda. It does include a continued hard line with China. And even before this convention, where he's talked a lot about China, he was talking about it beforehand and also talking about his opponent, Joe Biden. Let's listen.
China will own our country if he gets elected. They will own our country, and we're not going to let that happen. And you've seen the intelligence reports. China very much wants Joe Biden to win. That would be very insulting if they wanted me to win. I don't think so.
Einar, we've been hearing a lot of this kind of rhetoric from the President of the United States. You're sitting there in Beijing, a spectator watching all of this play out as we march towards November. I'm sure, even though there's social distancing, you're probably not bumping into folks, but you are talking to them. What's the take there in Beijing on all of this?
Well, it's kind of scratching their head. Obviously, Donald Trump has engendered a lot of negative, press and also reaction. I mean, what he says about China almost on a daily basis, if not him, Pompeo, is insulting. I mean, and surprisingly, most of the Chinese populace has not taken it out on Chinese brands. Remember, there's $500 billion worth of revenues by U.S. companies in China, and so far that has not materialized in any kind of boycott. But going forward, I'm certain there's this kind of trade-off. Short term, yes, Trump is a problem, but they see some way of kind of dealing with him. On the other hand, Biden, although he's a much nicer person to deal with, he will definitely be trying to create a coalition which is going to push China, especially on areas of differences in terms of human rights, Hong Kong, etc. So it's a kind of a devil in the deep blue sea for many people here. Right now, they're content to just wait and see what's happening with Donald Trump and his administration.
Wang Cong, what are you hearing? Because, the Democratic presidential candidate, it's worth noting, Joe Biden says he would remove these tariffs on China. So how are people viewing it that you're talking to there in China?
Yeah, from officials and experts I've been talking to in Beijing, I mean, there's no delusion that no matter which of the candidates came into power, the overall tougher line on China will not change, and that we have to be prepared for both. Yes, there are the two candidates have very different styles, but as far as China concerned, we must be prepared for a more tougher line, a more hostile. Some of them describe this hostile U.S. towards China. As far as what Trump, I think he just tweeted that Chinese state media and government want Joe Biden to win. I think nobody really takes that serious. I think he's just saying that for his voters. China has been very, very careful after the accusations of China, interfere with U.S. elections without any proof. But China has been very, very careful. And I also want to point out on Chinese social media, a lot of people actually are saying that we want Trump. On social media, there are talks about how Trump has been named as 川建国, that's building China, literally. So the thinking is that Trump has been very tough on China, and in turn push China to make necessary reforms and everything. So I think what Mr. Trump said, I think, is just campaign rhetoric, and nobody really takes it serious. But overall, China is not is preparing for both. I think a more hostile U.S.
Yeah, and Anna, on one hand, it's interesting the Trump administration says it's committed to a trade deal with China, and yet President Trump said in a Fox interview he's raised the possibility of decoupling the U.S. economy from China. So talk to me about that, because it seems like they are so integrated. Decoupling would not just hurt China, it would hurt the United States as well, right?
Oh, absolutely, Mike. It would most certainly hurt the United States. However, that is a message that is a little bit hard to deliver. It's a complicated message. It's not complicated to try to tie everything that Americans are experiencing on a daily basis with continued quarantining, continued inability to go to work, health crises because of the COVID pandemic. That's not difficult to tie to China politically. And, I think we're looking at a situation where we can't have an election that is a referendum on the health of the U.S. economy and how the administration has bolstered the economy. Not anymore. So now we have a referendum on how the administration is dealing with China. It's become far more hawkish. And, the main drivers of China's strategy right now don't seem to be the counselors who are particularly focused on the health of the economic relationship. It's interesting to hear about the hesitation to boycott U.S. goods in China. That's great news from a U.S. company's standpoint. On the other hand, though, there are all sorts of things that the administration is doing, not just words but actions, that actually could further that kind of destruction of U.S. business success in China, could further decoupling kind of rapidly. For instance, the executive order on WeChat could have enormous consequences depending on how it is interpreted and how it is applied. And we are in a wait-and-see position to find out, do they intend to apply it just to the United States, or is it going to be extraterritorial? Is it going to apply to U.S. operations and U.S. persons in China? If so, that could rapidly speed up decoupling to the detriment of U.S. business on the ground in China, and also to the detriment of American workers here at home.
Well, unspool that for us, because I think some people who might be watching this really don't understand, how important WeChat is. I mean, from a business standpoint, our business, we have conversations with people on WeChat. We don't email, and it's become, and when you're in China, it seems like it's kind of this thing that you have to have. And if you're doing business in China, it's critically important as well, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Not to diminish the seriousness of the executive order on TikTok at all, but TikTok is essentially an entertainment platform. And I think that there is wide misunderstanding in the United States that WeChat is not like TikTok. It is not just an entertainment platform. Of course not. It is integrated into daily communications of all sorts, official and unofficial, formal and informal. It's a payment platform, a dominant payment platform, to the extent that many institutions don't take cash; they take your WeChat we pay QR code. And it is a fundamental way that companies interact with their customers, with their employees, and provide services. And many of our companies say that they just simply will not be able to compete in the China market if they are told that they can no longer operate with that platform.
Yeah. Einar, let's turn to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He had a controversial appearance at the RNC last night. He had a lot to say about China. Let's listen to some of it.
This president has led bold initiatives in nearly every corner of the world. In China, he's pulled back the curtain on the predatory aggression of the Chinese Communist Party. The president has held China accountable for covering up the China virus and allowing it to spread death and economic destruction in America and around the world.
Red meat for his base, but I want to get your reaction. How's Beijing reacting to this?
Well, this is just more O'Donnell Associates' big plan, coronavirus, blame China strategy. I don't think there's anything new, except that he was doing it from Israel, as his deal seems to be hitting some cold water, this kind of Arab peace deal. So I think he's really a distraction. People are looking at him in terms of he's trying to position himself as a potential candidate in 2024. He's pursuing a much harder line than Donald Trump normally would. And he has that latitude because the president is distracted by his own troubles with his election. I just want to make one comment about the RNC is that it's interesting that the most effective speakers were women and minorities. Kind of an irony given that Donald Trump is appealing mostly to white men.
Wang Cong, it's worth noting that the clip that we showed, he said China, Chinese Communist Party, China needs to be held accountable for the China virus. We hear China virus over and over again from this administration, the President of the United States also uttering it the first night at the convention. This vilifying, these words, there's been a lot of writing about how this is just racist and it can cause racial assaults. And John Terrett, our reporter in New York, has a piece today about a new NYPD task force. It's the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force. So talk to us about the words and the impact that they can have.
Oh, of course. I mean, from the start of this epidemic, officials and experts have been warning that there's an epidemic of virus going on, and also there was an epidemic of racism going on and discrimination. And what the U.S. Officials, including President Trump, who repeatedly using this China virus, Wuhan virus, and I think Mike Pompeo is the biggest, I think, pusher in terms of this rhetoric, this narrative that to blame China for the virus. Of course, when the President of the United States and the Secretary of State of the United States push such narrative, they will take hold and they will give comfort or support to these already rising racial tensions and discrimination in United States and I think around the world towards Chinese nationals and even the broader Asian community. So I think it's really irresponsible after all this, after this epidemic killing millions of people, affecting millions of people. And they're still pushing this, discriminatory, racist narrative. I think it's really irresponsible. But as far as what Pompeo said from Israel, I think in China, a lot of people are not really taking him as serious as before because, Pompeo has been criticized very, very harshly, I think unprecedentedly, as far as, U.S. Secretary of State concerned in China. And I think even social media, ordinary man on the streets don't really take him as serious anymore because what he pushes, this narrative, this language, I think it's not befitting of the Secretary of State of the United States.
Speaking of befitting of Secretary of State from the United States, Jeff, I want to get your take on his speech because it is kind of shrouded in controversy. The State Department, in fact, Pompeo pushed out to diplomats all around the world saying, Don't get mixed up in politics. We've got an election coming up. There is this Hatch Act, which is a federal law prohibiting government employees from political activity on the job or in their official capacity. So was this a breach of diplomatic decorum, do you think, that his speech from Jerusalem?
It was a violation of the Hatch Act, which is U.S. legislation, and that ought to be enforced. He should not have done that. This is unprecedented in terms of behavior of a Secretary of State. And as for the rhetoric, I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm not going to try to justify all of this incredible and over-the-top rhetoric. What we really ought to be talking about is the issues. The election is what's bringing all of this up. And Trump always thinks short-term and domestic. So I think what people in China need to remember is that this is political speech for a domestic audience, and that they ought to be thinking more about the substance and also about what has really changed in the American electorate and why Trump thinks this is important to speak in this manner. There was a poll by Pew, which is a very respected polling agency, that found at the end of last month that 83% of Republicans and 68% of Democrats had a negative view of China, which is something that really needs to be taken seriously and taken into account. And I hope that China will think about why that is the case and some of the aggressive steps that have led to it and how we can get the bilateral relationship back on track. Because I'm a globalist, I think the bilateral relationship is essential, and we really need to find a way to get it back on track.
Anna, I want to get your thoughts. Maybe you can talk about what Jeff was just talking about, getting this relationship back going again. But I also want to get your thoughts on Pompeo's action. He says it's a violation of the Hatch Act. What were your thoughts when you saw him delivering the speech from Jerusalem?
Well, look, you know,
Well, we don't have any disagreement on that. Definitely, the Hatch Act was violated. The issue here right now is China is looking towards a macroeconomic future. In fact, that was one of the things that they talked about after the trade meeting, and it was poo-pooed by the USTR, saying that that's not within their purview. So, you know, at this point, China is not the aggressor. I know Jeff wants to portray it that way, but quite frankly, all of the aggressive acts against Chinese tech companies, et cetera, have been perpetrated by Donald Trump and his administration in this effort to vilify. And in terms of the effects of this, you know, if you're being attacked, I mean, the number of attacks, hate crimes against Asians swelled from a few a month to now hundreds a day, according to the latest indices. So, yeah, it's small comfort to Asians in America who are being attacked just simply because they look Asian.
Anna, I want to give you a chance. You were jumping in. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, I think there's just a very obvious conflation of what issues exactly we have with China versus what issues are domestic. We have a domestic epidemic right now that, like most Americans, I would like to see our government get a handle on. And that is really entirely independent of how the virus got started, how it arrived here. That really doesn't matter right now nearly as much as what can our government do to slow down the fatalities and get us to a place where we can go back to work and go about our normal lives again. Unfortunately, I guess we're looking at a situation where it's so difficult to figure out a plan to accomplish those things that it's easier to focus on how did this start and to rile people up about the cause or potential cause or source of the virus. And it is fueling racism, and it's not the only front on which we're seeing racism fuels. It's sort of like the same cast of characters is leaning into racist rhetoric about Asians and about so many other minorities.
Einar, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Italy this week, part of a European tour. He was asked about whether or not the United States and China are angling towards a Cold War. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I spoke earlier about a Cold War mentality. I wish to simply say China will never want a Cold War. We actually think of the opposite, because a Cold War would be a step backwards in the development of history. We will not let other countries do this for their own private interests while damaging the interests of other countries, because this goes against the history of development. And I am convinced that you here would agree to not let that happen and would be against it.
So are we slipping into a Cold War between these two countries?
No, I don't. I mean, the Chinese government is trying to prevent that, and that's why you see these continued efforts to, you know, keep this trade deal in, because this is literally the last piece of, the last bridge that's linking these two economies. China doesn't want a decoupling. I don't think American business wants a decoupling. But, this could be a very, very short-term situation come November. Like I said, it's not clear what happens after that. I would agree with my colleagues. It's not going to be great for China, but hopefully there's an ability to dialogue and talk about what the real issues are. I mean, Jeff is right. There are differences, and they have to be overcome. But they shouldn't be overcome with this constant negative rhetoric that is turning people, these two nations, against each other in terms of racial ideas and profiles.
Wang Cong, we talked earlier about WeChat with Anna. I want to get you to kind of chime in on that as well, but also TikTok. Where do you see that going? How's that going to play out? We know TikTok's going to court about this. How long is this going to play out, and how tense can this relationship get?
I think with regard to TikTok, I think they're preparing for the worst. They said last week that they were preparing for shutdown of the U.S. Their U.S. operations, and the WeChat I think has a little bit more. I think so far because the news report said over the weekend that the Trump administration is privately talking to U.S. businesses and allowing them to use WeChat, because I mean that is really a platform for many U.S. businesses, including Apple and others, to sell their products, because that's what we use for everything in China. With regard to the overall relationship, I think this is not going to be a Cold War or a new Cold War in the sense that the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union, because of the complex businesses ties between the two countries. So I don't think that is really happening. However, I agree with Jeff that a lot of this rhetoric are just for the elections and short-term rhetoric for just the presidential election. However, they are very risky. They are very dangerous. Just 2 days ago, they sent U-2 bombers. That's the iconic, I think, Cold War warplane to China, to areas where were restricted and where the Chinese PLA were holding exercises. Also, just last night, they announced a new sanctions against 24 Chinese companies in the South China Sea. So these are, we understand and we get it that he wants to, hype up this China tension to win an election. However, this is a very dangerous. What if those, by miscalculation, one of those planes got shut down? It's possible given this tension. So I think they're playing with fire. We understand, I mean, Chinese officials, some I've been speaking to, they understand a lot of this rhetoric have to be seen within the U.S. domestic politics. Yeah. But what they're doing is very risky and dangerous. That's the point.
Well, Wang Cong, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all our guests for joining us. It's been a great discussion, and that is it for this edition of The Heap. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.